Hey Sugar Snaps, welcome to the Textile Indie YouTube channel. If you're new here, my name is Brittany. If you're an old friend, welcome back. Glad to have you. Today we are joined again by Sherry to go over more embroidery content, materials, and tools. Let's dive in.
Today I have my 10 must-have embroidery supplies and materials. First up, you're going to need some way to organize your embroidery floss. My favorite are these plastic bobbins. You can get about 50 of them for a few dollars. They're a great investment and they will last you forever. In our organizing floss video, we talked about some other ways to do this. There's also beautiful wooden bobbins that I linked to in the post that I did on organizing floss. They're works of art in themselves. So you can get quite fancy, but these don't cost very much and they will suit you for a long, long time. The second thing on my list is good lighting. It doesn't have to be a fancy craft light, although that's great. You can just use the occasional light next to the chair that you embroidery in, or have a small light that you can drag around from place to place wherever you're working. It will improve the quality of your embroidery immediately because you can see the different strands in the weft of your fabric. Is that right, Weaver? Yep. Yeah. And it will help you to stay on track, keep your lines straight, and put that needle exactly where you want it. Also, if you're a person of a certain age, it gets harder and harder to see what you're doing without taking your glasses on and off and on and off. And a strong light can really help you to not have to do that so much. And it's also great when you're threading needles. So a good light will keep your eyes from being tired.
Next up is stabilizer and tracing paper. We use the tracing paper when we're working with finer fabrics. You trace your design onto the tracing paper, pin that to your fabric, and then stitch through that. Once you're done with the embroidery project, you can tear it away. My personal favorite is the iron-on stabilizer. You can trace the design onto this as well and then iron it onto your fabric, or iron it on and then trace it if you're using heat transfer pins, which we'll be talking about here in a minute. And this is my favorite because it stabilizes the fabric and it's washable. So as soon as you're done with your project, you can just rinse it off with some water and this washes right off. It's less picking little bits of paper out of your design. The stabilizer doesn't work as well on finer fabrics or fabrics that don't wash as well. So stabilizer or tracing paper, or both.
Next up is not an essential for me, but it seems to be an essential for 9 out of 10 embroiderers that I've talked to, and that is a bobbin winder. This is a little plastic doohickey that sits on the side of your embroidery box, and it holds the bobbin and quickly winds the embroidery floss onto your bobbin. I find that winding embroidery floss is very therapeutic. I like to do it while I watch TV, so I've never had a bobbin winder, but many of you will want one, and they only cost about $1.88 to $2. The next thing are heat erasable pins. You can use these to trace your design onto tracing paper, straight onto the fabric, or onto your stabilizer, and when you're all done, you just go over it with an iron and it erases the ink. So a funny thing about these, I've been traveling this week and I've been keeping my heat erasable pins in my cooler because I hear that if you leave them in a hot car, you'll come back and all of the ink will have disappeared. And maybe if you put them in the fridge, the ink will reappear, but I didn't want to risk that with my $20 set of pins. So keeping them cool is important. However, I did test it on the pattern that I transferred onto a piece of fabric, and I've kept that embroidery project in the car this week, and it's no worse for wear. I can still see the lines perfectly. So the heat in the car, which we would say is about 150 degrees right now because it's very hot, wasn't significant enough or direct enough to make the ink disappear.
And of course, you're going to need embroidery needles to do your needle working projects. So we have a little case here that we like to keep all of our embroidery needles in. And this is super handy because as I experienced as a child, you can often end up with pins and needles on the floor or on your workspace. And I do remember getting in trouble a couple of times for having pins sticking out of my carpet and family members almost stepping on them. So having a little carry case is super handy. The needles for embroidery, they are specific and they come in sizes ranging from
5 to 12 is typical.
Okay, so check your embroidery pattern because they will specify their suggested material and also the needle that would work best for that material and the needle size. Typically, the eye of the needle is different depending on the type of fabric that you're using. Finer fabric, finer eye. Larger fabric, you can get away with a larger eye. It is easier to thread a larger eyed needle, so keep that in mind. But having a set of embroidery needles, and again, check your embroidery pattern for that specific size.
I just want to add, since you threw me under the bus, that we didn't almost step on the pins and needles. We did step on the pins and needles.
Sorry.
Next up, you have hoops. You're going to need some way to stabilize your project. That's usually done with embroidery hoops. You have your common wooden type. You can pick these up at thrift stores pretty easily, but I find they're quite slippy and the fabric doesn't stay in place. It will tend to start to sag over time. I really like these plastic ones. They come in different brands. This happens to be Nerge. And what I discovered, I thought plastic would be even more slippy, but they have a little groove inside. So once you get this set up, that fabric is not going anywhere. It stays nice and tight inside of the groove. These come in all sizes and shapes, and you can get like a pack of graduated ones if you want more. But I love these. They are very handy to have.
And the tension of your fabric when you're embroidering is pretty key to the success of your embroidery project. I had a piece that I was doing in one of the wooden ones, and as I worked, it became looser and looser, and I realized that where I was stitching was starting to bunch up the fabric because the fabric was loose, but my stitching was still as tense, so I ended up with some bubbling in my design. So tension in the fabric is key. Go for the plastic ones if you can. Another key tool to working in embroidery is embroidery scissors. These are specific to embroidery because they have small, short blades. They're super sharp. They'll cut through the embroidery floss that you're working with without fraying the ends. If you're using paper scissors, you're going to end up having to kind of eat through that thread, and then it's a real nightmare to have to thread through your needle. So nice, sharp scissors are key. And having a pair per project is ideal because if you have a project in your purse, on the couch, in the car, different places so that you can sneak in a few stitches here or there as you have time. Having to go find your scissors from one project to the other will kind of eat up the time that you actually had to work on your project. So multiple of these scissors, one per project, is really handy, and they are fairly cheap, so it's not super expensive to be able to do that.
Next up are needle threaders. Of course, you don't have to have a needle threader, but I find that to be an incredibly frustrating thing to get all 6 strands of that embroidery floss through an eye of a needle. So there are a couple different types. This one that often comes with your needles, and these are fine to get started, but they're a little bit cheap. And so when you start yanking that thread through, either the wire will cut through the embroidery floss or this thing just completely falls apart. I go through these quite regularly, but that's a good start. This one you can pick up for a couple of dollars at the craft store. It has these metal hooks on the ends and then of course the other wire. If you're getting into more of a wool embroidery that uses thicker yarn and a larger needle, these are nice for pulling that thick yarn through. The smaller one works great on needles with a little bit bigger of an eye. So this is very handy to have. But in a pinch, you can also just use dental floss. You just do that by making a loop, putting it through the eye of your needle, sticking your embroidery floss through the loop, and pulling it through. Most people have some dental floss on hand, so this is good to use in a pinch.
And lastly, you're going to need embroidery floss. We like the DMC brand because they have a lot of different colors, and we explained how the colors worked in our Organizing Your Embroidery Floss video. Find that up here and in the description below. Mom's collection is nice and neat and tidy with all the different colors, so she can pull from the different colors as needed for her designs. They also have the little numbers on them. Again, that's in the organizing video, but some sort of embroidery floss. Again, we really love DMC.
In the end, what you really need to get started to embroidery is a pattern, some type of hoop, needles, some floss, and probably a pair of scissors, which you could steal out of your sewing kit. So embroidery is a very inexpensive craft to get started with and test out if you see if you like it. And then of course you can add on endless accessories and cool new things, as is with any craft.
And we definitely need some slightly cheaper hobbies here at Textile Indie.
Yes, you do.
Well, Sugar Snaps, thanks for joining us for this 10 must-have tools for working in embroidery. We are continuing in our embroidery series in the next few weeks, so be sure to check back and check the community tab for updates. Thanks for being here. Until next time, happy making. Bye.
Bye.